There is a garden, there is a city, and there's a kingdom of God. And it is beautiful, and he is bringing it right now into our midst.
We are all going somewhere. We have a destination, a direction, a place we want to be. As we make our way there, we at times find ourselves losing our way. Jesus says, He is the way, for He is truth itself. Walking this way with Jesus, of trusting the truth of Jesus, it's life, abundant and full, thriving, flourishing, now and forever.
Did you guys ever hear this quote from Mark Twain? I think it's great. It's not the things in the Bible that I don't understand that bother me, it's the parts I do. And wow, isn't that true? I mean, there's some things in the Bible that are so clear, so easy to understand, and yet a little bit hard to agree with, to work with. And maybe one of those things is going to be what I'll talk about today in our message. Back in the 1980s, M. Scott Peck was a psychologist. He was actually, he was on a pretty interesting journey. He had become a follower of Jesus, and he wrote a book that became a bestseller at that time, and it was called The Road Less Traveled. And in that book, he talked about a better way of life, but not too many people seem to be embracing that better way of life. He began his book by saying life is difficult, and wow, did people ever resonate with that. Well, this idea of a road less traveled, that was not unique to M. Scott Peck. He had actually borrowed it from the poet Robert Frost, and in his poem called The Road Not Taken, and it begins with two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and then then Frost goes on to talk about these two different roads that were diverging, going different directions. He looked at them both, considered them both, and then he finishes by saying, I took the road less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. And so, that theme was, a couple different roads. One's a little bit easier, one's a little bit harder, and one's more traveled, and one's not as traveled. And I took the one that wasn't quite as traveled. But that wasn't novel with Frost either. I believe that he, at least in part, was ruminating on, pulling from the words of Jesus in Matthew chapter 7, where Jesus is talking about two different roads, two different gates, two different ways. And what I'd like to do, if you don't mind, is I would like to read that from the Message. I really enjoy how Eugene Peterson has translated it. He says, don't look for shortcuts to God. The market is flooded with surefire, easygoing formulas for a successful life that can be practiced in your spare time. Wow, does that ever just describe what our culture is all about? But he goes on and says, don't fall for that stuff. Even though the crowds of people do, the way to life, to God, is vigorous and requires total attention. And maybe that's one of the reasons why it is the road less traveled. It does require a lot of attention. It does require a lot of energy, a lot of vigor. It's rigorous. But that wasn't even really unique with Jesus. Jesus was drawing on the Old Testament tradition that was well acquainted with ways, with paths, with journeys. And in fact, for the people of Israel, they had been used to a way of life called slavery in Egypt. It had been their way for a long, long time, and God was going to be taking them out of that way of slavery, of suffering, and of destruction, and bringing them into a new way, a new place called the Promised Land, and it would be a way of freedom and a way of flourishing. And very near the end of the life of Moses, Moses is the mouthpiece for God, and gives just like an instruction to the people, pretty core, and it says this, I have set before you life and death. Now, choose life. So God said, look, I'm giving you life, but you got to choose it so that you and your children may live and that you may, now listen, this is what life is all about. So you may love the Lord your God, listen to his voice, and hold fast. We could maybe use the word follow. Follow him, for the Lord is your life. I mean, that's it. There's life and death, and Israel, you know what death was all about, and what I'm offering you is the way of life, and that way of life is loving God, listening to God, following God, because God himself is your life. And the Proverbs pick up this theme of ways. More than 60 times there's a word about the ways, and bad ways and good ways. And the word path is used about 30 times. So the Proverbs are rich with that language of being sure to pay attention to the ways that you're walking. Be steadfast in walking the good way. Understand that God examines the ways that we walk. God sees the ways that we walk. And one of my favorites is there's a way that seems really good for us to walk, but we're deceived because really if we walk that way, it's going to wind up ending in destruction. So M. Scott Peck, Robert Frost, Moses, the Proverbs, and Jesus are all together agreeing that this thing called way making is really significant. You see, to be a way maker is to be alive. To be alive is to be a way maker. We are always making our way. We are finding our way. At times we seem to be losing our way. We get stuck, we are stalled out, we run into potholes, we hit detours and dead ends and roadblocks and all kinds of things. And we feel that we are not making very good progress on the way. And yet we want to be making progress on the way. You've heard of the midlife crisis. The midlife crisis, one person describes it as a time in life when all of the unaddressed past issues and problems and struggles that we've never done anything with, and we followed those things and allowed them to influence us. Midlife is when those things erupt with a vengeance into our experience. And we now are paying and experiencing the repercussions of all those earlier choices. Some time back, I became aware that there's now a quarter life crisis. I mean, you don't have to wait till midlife anymore. You can have it at quarter life. However, what's really interesting is a lot of the research is looking at this group of individuals called millennials and discovering that millennials are not waiting until the middle of their life to have the crisis. They're having it at quarter life, rarely 25, 26, and 27. Some significant studies done on what life is like for millennials, and life apparently for many millennials is that difficult that at about 26 years of old, they're hitting a wall. They're realizing life is not working out. In fact, one major study, this one was done in England, 77% of all millennials say they have been in a serious quarter life crisis or they are currently in one. And it is hard, it is painful, they feel disillusioned. It lasts about a year for them. A lot of them never really make their way forward, but it's a quarter life crisis. Many of us are aware of the growing numbers. And by the way, there's no guilt, there's no shame. That's not why I'm going to say what I say next. But many of us, we've been walking ways that they're building into us. They're resulting in anxiety and depression, growing problems in our culture, and anger, another growing problem in our culture. Where is that stuff coming from? Well, apparently it's coming from the ways that we have been walking. And what's happening is we are having these pretty brutal encounters with reality. You know, we have been making some wrong choices and having all the consequences, and things just are not working out. Here's 4 areas where they're not working out. Our health is a wreck these days. When you look at what's going on in American culture, we are not a very healthy people. Secondly, our finances are in complete disarray, which is why the Financial Peace University could be one of the most important things you will do in 2019. Our sexuality is all over the place, and we're making all kinds of sexual choices that are hurting us. And fourth is we're not taking time to invest in the vital relationships that matter the most and make life so joyful or so painful. And so you put those four things together and a bunch of others, and no wonder we're having anxiety, depression, and anger, because those most important things are just not working out very well for us. And then to that, you add our North American tendency to look for diversions and distractions, entertainments, amusements, addictions, all to sort of escape the hard reality of life. But we all know then that going down those particular pathways don't really deal with reality. In fact, as we try to escape from reality by doing all those things, we discover that those choices have only made reality even more painful. And so a lot of our ways, they've not been working very well for us. And so the question I have is there a better way? Jesus, is there a better way? Can you clue us into that better way if there is? Last week when we began our series, the whole theme was on the Jesus I never knew, but the Jesus I need to know. I said there were two questions that were very important. Jesus asked both of them. Number one, he says, who do the people say I am? In other words, what's the word on the street? What's the scuttlebutt? What's the gossip? What's the stuff going around about who I am? Because I know I'm doing a lot of stuff and people are talking about me. So who do they say I am? And then the second question, which is even more significant, well, what about you? How do you experience me? Who am I to you? What's our relationship like? Two extremely important questions. And we spent a little bit of time last week looking at all the different images and answers about who this Jesus might be that have been floating around in our culture for a little while. Well, there's a third question, and that's what today's all about. The third question is, what does Jesus say about himself? Who does Jesus claim to be? Because if Jesus claims to be something, then if we're going to truly encounter the real Jesus, then we're going to be encountering the Jesus who is who he claims to be, and we're going to have to wind up reorienting and adjusting our lives around this real Jesus and what he says about himself. And it is this Jesus who says in John chapter 14, verse 6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. A pretty powerful, striking claim, because there are lots of ways, lots of truths, lots of possibilities for life in his culture. And Jesus just came along and said, listen, yeah, they're all there, but let me tell you, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And he went on and said, therefore, I am uniquely positioned and able to help you in a way nobody else is, to draw near to this Father God in heaven who is a simply beautiful God. Now, that verse, those two verses are really embedded in a larger section, very, very rich. And in fact, one of your devotional assignments this week, I believe on Monday, will be for you to look at the whole passage that John 14:6 is embedded in and get the riches of that passage. You're really going to enjoy that particular reflection that you'll do. Would you guys, though, let me take a bit of a detour? Would you let me sort of geek out on you for a couple minutes? Would you let me be a nerd? And you're saying, well, you already are, so we don't have to let you be those things. But let me be a little bit of a history geek for you. Now, when Jesus died and rose again, I mean, at that moment, there were probably about 200, a couple hundred more, legit followers of Jesus. And when you read the early chapters of the book of Acts, you see there's something pretty striking going on right there in Jerusalem and parts of Israel. So there's actually quite a few people starting to follow Jesus right there in Israel. But as soon as we start to break out into the rest of the Mediterranean world, things are very, very different. So we have a map here of what the Mediterranean world is. It's all the basic countries that were part of the Roman Empire, and they're surrounding the Mediterranean. The word literally means the middle of the earth. And so at that point, there would have been like 0 followers of Jesus. By 40 AD, the best we can tell as we look at the best sociologists, the anthropologists who study, there were probably about 1,000 followers of Jesus by 40 AD in the Mediterranean world. Now, not a lot. And those that were there were probably largely there because of the works of this person called the Apostle Paul. Now, when we fast forward to 100 AD, things are changing a little bit. Now there are about 10,000 followers of Jesus by the time the century has come to an end. So the movement is growing. It's still not spectacular, but it is growing. Now we go 100 years later, and that 10,000 followers has grown to 200,000 followers. You see, the trajectory is skyrocketing, and now we go 100 more years to 300 AD, and there are now about 6 million followers of the way of Jesus in the Mediterranean world. It has simply been an exponential, explosive movement taking place. Now, that happened then. And my question is, why did it happen? How did it happen? And in fact, some scholars are actually a little surprised that it did happen, because to follow the way of Jesus was not an easy thing. There were going to be costs. There were sacrifices. It was a little bit risky to be one of those followers of Jesus through the centuries. There were a lot of repercussions that came against them. And in spite of all those things, it grew it just grew amazingly. It was like this black swan event person called Jesus that erupted on the scene. His very life was like this spiritual tidal wave washing over the entire Mediterranean. But how? Why? What did it exactly look like? Well, here's basically what they found. There were 5 things that were so central to this explosive growth that made Christianity, that made Jesus so attractive to that world at that time. Number 1 is, really, in the only way that anybody was talking, there was a personal God who wanted to be deeply, deeply connected with your life. Now, that wasn't there in the Roman Empire. They had lots of gods, but they were small gods. They were puny gods. They were local gods, particular gods. There was a god of the water, and a god of the air, and a god of the sun, and a god of the moon. But those gods were all kind of fickle. They really weren't that involved in the lives of people. They didn't really care for the people. They sometimes played games with humanity. And really what we tried to do is avoid the notice of those gods or placate those gods or somehow, manipulate the God into answering a particular wish that I had. But there was like no sense of personal relationship with those small gods. And plus they were so small. And Christianity came along with the message, oh no, there's a big God. He's enormously big and he's personal and he loves you so much and you can love him back. I mean, it was a radical new conception that had been non-existent in the Roman Empire. Now that was the core. Now there's more stuff that happened. The second thing is that there was a belief system that was compelling. It made sense for the people. By the way, at that time, none of the other religions, with the exception of Judaism, which was mostly back in Israel, none of the religions of the Roman Empire had any kind of belief system. They didn't have any approach to life. They had some stories about the gods. They had a couple behaviors you should practice, a few rituals you should follow, but there were no significant answers to the issues, the problems, the struggles, the dynamics of life. And Christianity came along with this well-developed philosophy of life, a belief system of life. In fact, in that way, Christianity was much more like the ancient philosophers. Of course, those ancient philosophers didn't have any God to offer, but so here Christianity comes along not only with a personal God, but with a meaningful way of life that had answers for everything you wondered about. Who are we? Where do we come from? Why are we here? Is there meaning? Is there purpose? Who am I? What am I to do? Why is the world the way it is? What's gone wrong with the world? Is it possible for the world to be set right? And how can I know? And I mean, all these questions that was the stuff of life, and none of the religions of the day had any semblance of an answer. Christianity came along with a complete worldview, and it just made so much sense. But there was more. There was a way of living, a way of behaving, a moral code, and an ethical way of engaging all of life. There was virtue. In fact, some of the early stories of the Christians were these folks, more than anybody else, loved their neighbors. They went out at great cost and great sacrifice to serve the community. I mean, they behaved differently than most of the people. And look, I'm not going to beat up on the Roman Empire at that time, but it was not exactly a nice place. Morality was not exactly thriving in the Roman Empire. There's a lot of things that were really wrong and out of whack. And Christianity came along and it started changing people from the inside out. And they started living differently. And in fact, that's why Christianity started that was, the main reason why it started to spread. Hey, you guys are different. What makes you different? And then those first followers were able to say, well, let me tell you about the belief system, and let me tell you who's at the core of that belief system. It's this one called Jesus. But it was their way of living that was so attractive. But there's more. See, they just didn't have their individual lives. They were doing life together in a community like that world had never seen. It was just unheard of in the Roman Empire. All the divisions and barriers that tore people apart, that pushed people apart, in this thing called the church, they were being overcome. And so you had the rich and the poor, the slave and the free, all the different ethnic groups, men and women. They were all coming together and they were equals and they cared for one another. The playing field was level. They checked all their egos at the door. They checked all those old things at the door that would keep us apart. I mean, it was a community. A new community was emerging. That was very attractive. And there's one more thing. Now, by the way, there were actually more than that, but there's one more thing that was so core, and that is for the first time in that part of the world. And really, we sometimes just don't realize what people didn't know, but for the first time, there was a meaningful explanation of what happens when you die. There's more to life than just this life. I mean, throughout all the philosophies and ancient religions, hardly anybody had a decent answer to what happens when you die. There were shadows, there were guesses, there were hints. Most of the time, people just avoided it. Christians came along and said, oh no, let us tell you what Jesus has done about this thing called life and death, and let's talk about what he's going to do. And by the way, that's all part of the John chapter 14 passage where Jesus says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. And in fact, if you go and read, I hope you will this week, John chapter 14, verses 1 through 14, all 5 of these things are contained right there in that section. And it changed the world. It made Christianity so compelling and attractive at great risk. It was not an easy thing to become a Christian, yet they did, because those things were absolutely unique and overwhelming. And listen, the way of Jesus was unique back then. Nobody had said the kind of things that Jesus said when he said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. All right, I'm done being a geek. But that was then. That was the Jesus back then who completely transformed Not only individual lives, but a world. And I believe that the Jesus of then is the same Jesus we need today, the Jesus of now, who can change our lives and change our communities and maybe change our world. In fact, he's doing exactly that at places. Here's what I know. Every time the church gets embarrassed about Jesus Christ being the way, the truth, and the life, every time we get embarrassed by that and we say, well, let's kind of reduce Jesus down enough so that he will be palatable for your opinions. Let's make Jesus a really small God that doesn't interfere, that doesn't offend, that doesn't, every time we do that, that's when the church starts to shrink. Every time we reduce and water down Jesus so he's no longer the real Jesus, that's never been a good thing for the church. And every time the church has simply allowed Jesus to be the real Jesus, to be the way, to be the truth, to be the life, we're not embarrassed, but we want to be gracious and loving and gentle and careful, but always truthful and courageous. Whenever we said, listen, there is another way, and the church has grown. Now, sometimes it's grown slowly and at great risk. Other times it's just exploded. But it's only and always been if Jesus is actually the real Jesus we're talking about. And so here's what I believe and understand is that you and I, we need the real Jesus and his real way, his real truth, and his real life if we are to wind up having the kind of life that is flourishing. And that's exactly what Jesus wants to do. Are you with me so far? Okay, that's the theology. Let me move for a little bit to a couple of practical takeaways. Number one is we have to be in this for the long haul. Do you notice that Jesus did not say, I am a moment? He didn't say, I am an episode. He didn't say, I am a once and done. He said, I am the way. He could have said, I am the process. He could have said, I am the journey, because that's what he is. The way of Jesus is a long obedience in the same direction. In a lot of spiritual formation courses we do around here, we use a phrase, the way of Jesus is long, slow, deep, difficult, and personal, particular to you. But oh, is it ever so good? But it's long. We have to be in this thing for the long haul. In other words, the way of Jesus is not a sprint. The way of Jesus, you've heard this before, it's much more like a marathon. In fact, much more like an ultramarathon. Much more like an Ironman, an Ironwoman sort of way of living. And for those of you who are in the know, occasionally the way of Jesus becomes like a Tough Mudder. All right? Now, I'm not swearing at you. Tough Mudder is a kind of endurance race. Oh, man, do you ever have to be in pretty decent condition to run a Tough Mudder? But, every now and then, the way of Jesus over the long haul, there's a little bit of tough mudding that we have to go through. That's what happened for the first explosive movement of Christianity in those first 3 centuries. But it's a long haul. We're in this for the long haul. It's not an episode, not a moment. Okay, secondly, we have to give the way of Jesus the time that it needs. Now by that, I mean a couple things. Number one is we have to get past our instant gratification. We want results right now kind of mindset. The way of Jesus brings renewal, it brings repair, it brings restoration, it brings healing. It brings all kinds of things that are lacking into your life. It brings all of those things, but it doesn't bring them all at once. Have you heard this phrase, first we make our way, and then our way makes us? Okay, so listen, if we've been following another way, it's taken years for that way to bring harm and hurt into your life. It didn't happen all at once. It didn't happen the first time, the first day, the first week. But as we walk other ways that are unhealthy, it is the cumulative impact of those other ways that bring all the damage into our lives. Well, when we begin walking the way of Jesus, the restoration process begins, but it takes a little while. Now, forgiveness is immediate and instant and always. The very first time you connect with the real Jesus in a real way. The very first time you say, Jesus, I've not been your follower, but I'm going to start. I'd like to walk with you. I don't even know what all that means, Jesus, but I'm just telling you, I'm in this thing. I'm taking hold of your hand. At that moment, there is a supernatural experience that takes place where Jesus moves into your life and you are connected with him relationally, and forgiveness for all the stuff from the old ways. It's immediate, it's instant, it's complete. It's yours. It's just given to you. But everything else takes time. It takes time to recover from walking another way 20 years. It takes time to overcome the healing. It takes time to overcome the hurt and damage that's been from a bad marriage and a bad family for 20 years. It takes time to start to build good virtue and quality into your life when you've been irresponsible for 20 years. You see where I'm going? So the repair process, the reclamation process, the restoration process, it takes time. We have to give it the time, which is why it's a long haul. So don't get discouraged if everything's not happening for you right away. And also say this, the more time you give it day by day, week by week, the faster the process does go. When you only give it a little bit of time, occasionally once a month, then the process of repair and restoration is so much slower. So again, what you focus on expands. Are you with me? Okay, here's the third thing. We have to make it a priority. We have to buy in to this way of Jesus. So here's where Jesus does say, I am the way. In other words, I am an alternative way. I'm not an accessory to your current way. What I'm offering you is a different way from the way that you are walking. And I want my way to be your whole way. I don't just want to be a part of your life. I want to be all of your life. I don't want to be a hobby. Jesus doesn't have any interest in being a hobby for you. He wants to be your lifestyle. The other day I read an article. It wasn't an article. It was a blog from a guy I follow. And he had this really funny thing. Do you know Chipotle wants to be your lifestyle? Now, they have pretty good food, but they're not interested in you just enjoying their food. They want the Chipotle way to be your lifestyle. I mean, everything out there, everybody out there wants to be your lifestyle. Nike wants to be your lifestyle. Dancing with the Stars wants to be your lifestyle. The Rock with his new program, The Titans, wants to be your lifestyle. Your sports team wants to be your lifestyle. Not just an occasion. They want all of you. Your political party wants to be your lifestyle. I mean, everybody out there, everything out there saying, pick me, choose me, put me at the center of your life, and then once I am at that place, begin to redesign and realign your life around me at the center. Everybody out there wants to be your lifestyle. Jesus is no different. He wants to be an alternative to all those other things. And see, here's what happens is almost all those other things, they're so small, they can't do everything. And so what happens is we're really kind of like the first century Mediterranean world. We have our pantheon, we have our collection of small gods. They're all sort of vying for interest. And they'll take turns, and the NFL will move in for a while, and then something in March Madness, and everything wants to consume us and invite us to realign our whole way around them. That's what Jesus wants to do. Now, let me say something, and I do not want to be hard when I say this, but I have to say it. If Jesus is only a part, if Jesus is only an accessory for you, please, please do not blame Jesus when your life isn't working out. Please. Right? That happens all the time. I talk with folks all the time that Jesus is just a little part. He's just found a little niche in with everything else they're doing. And then life isn't working out because they're not really walking the way. They just pulled Jesus in as a flavor on the other ways that are much more important to them, and things aren't working out, and they blame Jesus. Don't do that. Don't ever blame Jesus if he's only a part. Now, if he is your whole and things are working out, go ahead and blame him. Have a great conversation with him. And I don't know where that conversation is going to go, but please, are you with me on that? Don't blame Jesus if he's only a little part of your life and things aren't working out. Okay, here's the last thing. I'm going to say this to all of us who are middle-aged. Middle-aged Christianity. We start out so passionate, so much fervor, so much devotion, so much allegiance. I mean, we're just running down this pathway with Jesus because he's done so much for us. And we do that for years and years and years. But you know what happens with middle age is after a while we start to get a sense of, I've been there, I've done that, I've gone to church a bunch, I heard a bunch of sermons, I read the Bible, I've been in some small groups, and after a while, the way that was once so passionate and powerful just starts to get a little bit blah for us, and we start to slowly be less committed on the way. And whenever we get to that place, we're actually at a pretty risky place. And at that point, Jesus wants to come in. There might be a bunch of us here that's kind of where we are. Jesus wants to come in and say, oh, no. Remember, you're in this for the long haul. It's going to take a bunch of time. It needs to be a priority. As it was 20 years ago, you need to say, that's what I want again. Let me leave you with this. You guys remember this great, great movie, Shawshank Redemption? Remember this great statement? Of guys who have been in prison for years and years and years. And they're dreaming about life after prison. And the whole thing is, listen, we either, every single day, we make a choice. We're going to get busy living or we're going to get busy dying. Every day, this week, you and I are going to make a choice. We're going to get busy living or we're going to get busy dying. Would you look at this image of Jesus? It's one of my favorite images of Jesus. He is inviting you to get busy living and stop dying. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Let me help you get real busy living. Would you pray with me? And hey, maybe there's a couple of you here, and maybe there's a few more watching by live stream. You're saying, hey, you know what, this Jesus way, I don't think I've ever taken my first step on it, and I am real interested. So hey, all you have to do is say to Jesus, yes. I say yes to your way. I get it that some of those other ways have brought me to a quarter-life crisis, a midlife crisis. And all my diversions are just escapes, and they don't really do anything for me. So Jesus, I'm going to try your better way. So help me to engage with a lot of passion and belief. And if you prayed that, I'm just going to say, stay a while on that way. Stay a while on that way. Keep on listening. Keep on coming back. Maybe for a whole bunch of us, man, we have been passionate about that way in the past, and it's dimmed a little bit, grown a little bit colder. Hey, maybe this is a time when we just realize Jesus is once again holding out his hands. Hey, how about this week, you and I, we get busy living and not slowly dying. Lord, make that so for all of us. Amen.